Hello. We're going to move forward now with adding some new features to our application. In this case, we're going to add authentication, that is being able to identify the user. We're going to use a product from Amazon called Amazon Cognito, and in particular, we're going to use a feature called user pools. So go to Cognito, go to Manage User Pools. This FYI, I'm not going to do this in Terraform for now. I may go back in the notes later and do it that way. Just partially because it wasn't clear how to get all the default settings that I wanted using Terraform, and I wanted to get the app, I wanted to do it with certain defaults. So that's something for later. What you do is you basically say create a user pool, and the pool name here, I'll call it to-dos or us. And you could go through the step-by-step. That'll take some time. There's a lot of settings. Since I want just the defaults for now, I just accept all the defaults. Basically, that's it. You create a pool. The next thing you need to do if you're going to create a pool is you need to go to domain name. This is basically the hosted domain name you're going to use when the user sees the login screen when they authenticate to your app, right? So it's hosted by Amazon. It's their hosted UI. Here you could use your custom domain, and we could do that, but for now, for simplicity, I'm just going to use their domain, just with a customized name, to-dos or us. Okay, that's it. Okay, and now the last step of this activity is you need to add what's called app clients, which are sort of basically the different front ends that will be used. And here you just say add app client, right? And I'm going to call this the web client, right? And we're going to leave all the defaults checked here. So just create app client, and we're done. Okay. At this point, there's a bunch of settings here, just so you know, but we're not going to change any of them. What I'm going to do is take a break because we're going to switch to the code now, to the front end code in particular, to see how we change the code to interact with this Cognito user pool. So I'm going to pause the video, get ready for that, and then we'll do that. Okay. Actually went ahead and got some things set up, and then I realized that we made a mistake or we didn't finish something. So I'm going to go back in here real quick. Under the app client, we were a little too quick on the settings for it. So if you just created the app client with those settings, some things would not have been checked. So one thing I did was and I've already done this and validated it worked, but you need to actually check the user Cognito pool that you actually want the web app client to actually work with the Cognito user pool. You need to provide URLs for basically the callbacks that happen after you get the login screens, right? So I'm developing locally right now, so I've set the local host. Once I'm done developing, I need to change these though to my basically the URL of my web page, which is, I believe it's on HTTPS with an S, todosorus.com, right? That's how you log in and log in. That's the entry point to the app. So I'll change you can have more than one. But they do suggest that if you're into production, you should not ever have local hosts. So you need to, only have that in your dev instances. But for us, I'm not being too careful. I mean, right now I'm going to just do it all here. You also need to check the authorization grant flow. We're not going to use the implicit flow or these current credential flows. So we're going to only use this authorization grant flow. And I want all the information I can possibly get from the user for now. So I checked all the boxes, and that's it. And just with that in place, you can see if I click on this right here, it'll actually bring up the sample UI of what, you see this on to-dos or us, right? .auth, blah, 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 right? But this is basically the screen that the user will be presented to log in. And you can customize this with their own logo and whatnot, right? But we're not going to do it this way. We're going to do it through our code. So now I'm going to change gears, and we're going to look at the solution here real quick. First of all, we'll look at the running solution, and then we'll look to see what I did to get it configured, and then we'll look at the code itself. and hopefully I don't run into any problems here. So the app now, when you restart it with the changed code, now doesn't get the to-dos initially. It actually comes up with a login option. And then that's that same hosted UI you get, right? And then in this case, I don't have any users in the account, so I have to actually create a user. So I'm going to create one called fred.user, fred at my email address, and the password. Let's see if I can get this right, so I don't remember. Okay, so you say sign up. Now, since I turned on the email verification is on by default, I need to go to my email or my phone or my email. I guess I go to my email and get the. Just so you know that the email you saw there is a fake email. No, it's not a fake email. It's a temporary email. I'm going to copy this. Let me copy this. Paste it here. Confirm account. Okay, and of course it did not work. So let me troubleshoot this a little bit, and I'll be back to you. It should have actually logged in already, so I must have done something incorrectly somewhere. Give me a minute. Okay, I'm back after troubleshooting. So the solution I ended up doing was I had already used this to-dos RS as the name of my user pool, and I'd already had used the app client of web, right? So I just ripped everything back out and went back in, did the exact same thing, but this time I actually named my user pool differently. And then I also named my app client customers, to-dos RS customers, and it just worked. So I have a feeling there was some weird, all I can think of is there's some error or bug in the world of Amazon that there was something left over from my user pool that just deleted a few minutes ago. So, either way, I can't tell you what exactly happened other than the fact that I just changed names and it all worked. So what does that mean? So it's the exact same thing as before. Let's go back and retry our app now. So what was supposed to happen was you're supposed to say log in, and I already created this user just in testing, right? So there already is a Fred user, and the user is, and you say sign in. And you authenticate and you're logged in. And then the app behaves as you expect, right? You can create to-dos, you can delete to-dos, and of course then you can log out. And then you can log in again, and anyway. I guess I'll log back in. Okay, so the question is, well, okay, so we know that it can work. The question is, how do I take the code and get it to do all this, right? The user pool set up, but now there's code changes that had to happen. Now, there is a fair amount of complexity here. So the first thing, and I don't want to necessarily go through all the details, the first thing is on Medium. If you look up, search for John Tucker OAuth. I'll have a link for this too, actually. Probably in, we'll have a link to this in the backing story, right? But I actually wrote a fairly lengthy article describing this solution and kind of how it was built and sample code, and there's a lot here actually. I'm going to summarize it very briefly in looking at the solution that I wrote. So I'm going to close this up. And the first step to all this is to get the front end to work. Let me stop it. Okay. And again, the branch for this is available in the story, backing story. There is a couple environment variables that we need to set. Let's look at. So in order for let me blow this up. Okay, so and I'll just show you where these environment variables come from. So basically, the React app needs to know about the user pool, right? So and also, the first thing from before, it has to know where the back end is. I'm running it locally, so that's fine. That's old news. You have to have this this auth base. So when your OAuth kicks off, it needs to know, and it's always the same ending. But the to-dos rs-customers, that's the name of your app that you gave, right? So I changed it from to-dos rs to to-dos rs customers, and that's the name of the app, right? And that, you can see that value is basically to-dos. It's in the, right. Here's the app client name right here. To-dos rs customers, and then the tail end of it is always the same. Okay, that was one setting you had to set. You had to get the app client ID, and again, that's not a secret, so it's right here, app client ID, right here, app client ID. Okay, and then that's under app client settings. The next setting we need is and then the last step is we just need to know where to redirect back to when after you log in. That's localhost, and with that set up, the front end code will work. Now, let's look at the code briefly. And again, I don't want to get too bogged down in this. The big changes, the big guts of this, right? The app, I changed app itself, sort of have this concept of a login state, right? The meat of the complexity, and it's listed in that article, is in this auth. There's two parts of it. One is in the auth, there's a fair amount of code here that essentially does all of the API calls to Cognito to get new tokens and basically the whole login process, right? So there's a lot of complexity in that file. Another bit of complexity is now that we, and again, this probably could be run a little more cleanly, but we also want to, the backend code, which we'll look at briefly, also now is protecting all the endpoints, so you can't actually use the endpoints unless you're authenticated. So you need to basically pass those tokens as bearer tokens, which is this business around authorization headers. So the to-dos, I've adapted them to now also use the ID tokens, right? And the extra complexity is those ID tokens only last 1 hour. So if it fails, what it also tries to do, if it fails with a 401, which is unauthorized, right, it's going to take your refresh token and get a new refresh token, and then, it'll pass the refresh token and get a new ID token, and then it'll just retry the same fetch again, and if it works a second time, it resets all the local tokens, so for the next hour, it can continue to use the old ID token, right? So there's a fair amount of complexity in this code, right? It has to handle refreshes as well as the initial tokens, and it has to handle the initial login process. Otherwise, the rest of the code is, there's not much else code there, to be honest. Okay, so that's it for the front end code, right? And again, the repo is available in the story. The next step is the back end code. So let's look at that real quick and see. I'm going to pause the video and get myself oriented here. Give me a second. Okay, we're back. So I just switched back into my back-end code, right? And I'm going to point out some key changes here. So the first thing you do, just like the front end, there's some environment variables that need to be set before this code will run. And rather than having to set a bunch of environment variables, I changed the code a bit to use a feature of Python where you can actually set a settings file, and it'll use that as essentially your environment variables, right, for local development, right? So you don't have to set a bunch of. So the things that, the same as before, we had the app region before, right? That was what we used before as an environment variable. Now it's in the config file. There are 3 things that are specific to authentication we need to set. So the first one is one's easy. The app audience, that is the same. That's the client ID. So that's the. If I go back into here and I look at app client settings, this client ID right here is that same number. Okay, so that one's pretty easy. The app issuer, if you read the docs on this, the app issuer is basically the same beginning part, and this bottom part is this US East one. That is the pool, what's called the pool ID, and if you go to general settings, there's a pool ID right here. So it's that thing. Okay, that's another setting. And then the third setting is a little bit more complicated. What these are the public keys that are used to decrypt or verify the signatures of the tokens. And these are actually available on a particular URL that you have to construct. So the documentation for that, by the way, it's linked into in this article. There's a link to this article, which is by Amazon, and they basically tell you how to figure out, and there's a certain URL you go to, and you have to add in your region and your user pool ID. And if you do that, and you go to this thing, you end up with essentially, so the user pool, user ID, regions here, user pools here, you get you copy this. This is basically a series of public keys. And now actually, in hindsight, these keys can change. So right now this is sort of a future fix. Right now I'm hard coding this into an environment file, and I just realized that Amazon can change these keys. So I'm going to have to go back into the code. Actually, I put a to do. I need to actually dynamically pull this value rather than being hard coded in an environment variable. So that was a fix I just learned about. Long story short, you need to go with for now, I copy this and I paste it into the AWS JS keys, right? Now, by the time you look at this video, if you ever do, this probably will change, and this will not be hard coded in here. It'll be coming from a dynamic HTTP call from the back end. Well, anyway, as it is, you make those changes, right? And so let's see, made those changes, and then you run the code. Now, the main thing that's happening here, all the work, this code's only based on one file, and the big changes here, there's some changes around getting the config variables, and the meat of the authentication is in this authenticate method, and otherwise it's pretty much the same code as before, right? And this is where I'm basically picking up, looking for the authorization header being passed by the client and validating that one, it exists, and two, that it's actually the key line here is this JWT decode. Basically takes that JSON web token and decodes it, and then the payload essentially has all the user identification information on it. So that's kind of that code, right? Now, the last step of this activity is, well, after all this, we got it run locally, we have to deploy it. And I'm not going to necessarily do this on the video. I'm just going to talk about it because we've already done it to some degree. What I'm going to need to do is I'm going to have to think about environment variables, right? The front end had some new environment variables, and the back end had new environment variables. So I have to go back into our environments. The front end, it's our build environment that we have to set the environment variables, and then in the back end, it's our runtime environment. I have to add those new environment variables, and then I need to push the code, and if everything works the way expected, those build pipelines should trigger, and then push all that code, and then roll out new versions of the back end, and deploy a new version of the front end, and then we're done. So I'm going to do that off camera, and if anything pops up from that, I'll put notes in the story. Otherwise, that's what I would do off the screen. And I am going to fix the code to actually use live versions of those public keys after this. So that will change from now. So that's it for now. If we do all this, if you kind of recall, the main point of all this was, again, we cause the front end to be able to log in, identify users. Those API calls pass these ID tokens to the back end. The back end then will validate those before it allows the user to use the API, and at least we can get the user's credentials, like their ID, and then we can do, potentially do some logic around that on the back end. Yeah, that's it.